For more than 1,000 years, the Mississippi River was a wall. The longest river on the continent, wide and brown and merciless, and not a single bridge had ever crossed it. Not one. Native nations crossed it by canoe. French traders crossed it by ferry. Armies crossed it by raft and by luck. And then, in the spring of 1856, on a quiet stretch of water between Rock Island, Illinois, and Davenport, Iowa, a train of wooden cars rolled out onto a wooden bridge over the deepest channel of the Father of Waters and reached the other side. The first bridge ever built across the Mississippi. And here's the part that stops me. Within 2 weeks of its opening, a steamboat slammed into it and burned. Half the country cheered the fire, and the men who wanted that bridge gone hired the best lawyers they could find to tear it down by law. One of those lawyers on the other side, defending the bridge, was a tall, awkward attorney from Springfield named Abraham Lincoln. This is the story of the bridge that should not have been possible, and the trial that decided whether it would stand. To understand why this was so hard, you have to understand what the river meant. By the 1850s, the Mississippi was the great highway of America. Everything moved on it. Cotton came down from the south. Grain came down from the new farms of the Upper Valley. Lumber, hogs, whiskey, iron, people, all of it floated on the river, and all of it passed through the wharves of one city above all others: St. Louis. St. Louis was the queen of the river trade, and the steamboat was her crown. Hundreds of steamboats worked that water, tall white boats with their chimneys and their paddle wheels, and behind every one of them stood owners, pilots, captains, insurers, dockhands, and merchants whose entire living came from the river running free and open, from one bank to the other, with nothing standing in the way. And then came the railroad. The railroad came from the east, from the cities of the Atlantic, reaching westward year after year, and it carried a simple and terrifying idea. That goods and people did not have to go down to St. Louis and ride the river south. They could go straight across, east to west, on iron rails, fast, in any season, in winter when the river froze, and in summer when it ran low. The railroad did not want to use the river. The railroad wanted to cross it. And to a steamboat man, a railroad bridge across the Mississippi was not progress. It was a knife at his throat. A line of stone piers dropped into his channel. An obstruction. A wall across his highway. Both sides knew exactly what was at stake. This was a war over the future shape of the country, and the bridge at Rock Island was the first shot. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back. Because the men who actually drove the piers into that river never had their names written down, and somebody should remember that they were there. The men who pushed the bridge into being were railroad men, and the name to know first is Henry Farnum. Farnum was an engineer and a builder, a New England man who had come up the hard way, learning his trade on canals and then on railroads. With his partner, a wealthy financier named Joseph Sheffield, Farnum had pushed the Chicago and Rock Island Railroad westward across Illinois until it touched the eastern bank of the Mississippi. That was already an achievement. But Farnum understood that a railroad that stopped at the river was a railroad cut in half. The whole point was to keep going, into Iowa, across the plains, toward the west, that everyone could feel waiting out there. So the railroad chartered a separate company, the Railroad Bridge Company, and set out to do the thing no one had done: to span the Mississippi. The site they chose was not random. At Rock Island there is, in fact, a rock island, a long limestone shelf sitting in the middle of the river. The river splits around it. That meant the builders did not have to leap the whole width of the Mississippi in one impossible jump. They could land on the island, use it as solid footing, and break the crossing into manageable pieces. The island gave them stone to stand on in the middle of the current. It was the best place on the entire upper river to attempt a bridge, and the engineers knew it. But knowing the right place and building there are two different things. Think about what they did not have. They had no hydraulic cranes, no steel, no diesel pile drivers, no concrete trucks, no way to simply dam the river or pump it dry. They had the river running full force, day and night, never stopping, and into that river they had to plant stone piers deep enough and strong enough to carry the weight of a locomotive for the rest of time. The tools they actually had were old tools. Timber, stone, cut by hand from quarries, iron bolts and rods, horses and oxen for hauling, steam engines for power where they could rig them, and men, mostly men. Men in the water and on the scaffolding, in all weather, doing the work that machines would do today. Here is how they did it, and this is the part I want you to picture. To build a pier in a flowing river, you first have to find a way to work on the riverbed without the water rushing in. They used cofferdams, which are exactly what they sound like. Temporary walls of timber driven down into the riverbed to fence off a small patch of the bottom. Once the timber walls were down, the crews pumped and bailed the water out of the enclosed space, and now they had a pit, a dry, muddy hole sitting below the level of the river, with the whole Mississippi pressing on the wooden walls around them. Down in that pit, the men dug to firm footing, leveled the rock, and began to lay the stone. Block by block, each one cut and squared and lifted into place, the piers rose up out of the riverbed until they broke the surface and climbed into the air. 6 piers in all, plus the abutments on the banks. Stone, set by hand, in the middle of a living river. On top of those stone piers, they laid the bridge itself, and the bridge was made of wood. That sounds fragile to us now, but in 1856, wood was the proven material for long American spans, and the design they used was a thing of real ingenuity. It was called a howe truss. A howe truss is a frame of timber and iron, the wood taking the squeezing forces and iron rods taking the pulling forces, all of it locked together into a rigid beam that could carry enormous weight across open space. The bridge had 5 fixed spans, each one flat-topped and about 250 feet long. The long wooden arches anchored to the piers on either side. And in the middle, over the deep main channel where the steamboats had to pass, the builders did the cleverest thing of all. They built a draw. The draw span was a swing bridge. A section of the bridge, roughly 285 feet long, that sat on a turntable on the center pier and could rotate, swinging open to let a steamboat through and swinging shut to let a train across. At the time it was built, it was said to be the longest swing span in the world. Picture the machinery of it. A turntable riding on a ring of iron wheels, around 20 of them, running on a circular track nearly 30 feet across, balanced so perfectly that the whole long arm of the bridge could be pivoted open. The whole crossing ran something over 1,500 feet from bank to bank. That was the compromise the engineers offered the river. We will cross your water, but we will leave you a gate. Swing it open, and the boats go through. The steamboat men did not see a compromise. They saw the gate, and they hated it. The pilots had a name for the narrow opening over the main channel, a name that tells you exactly how they felt about being funneled between those piers with the current grabbing at their hulls. They called it the Gate of Hell. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. Before the bridge was ever finished, the fight had already begun, and it reached the highest offices in the land. Back in 1853, the Secretary of War of the United States was a Mississippi man named Jefferson Davis, the same Jefferson Davis who would later lead the Confederacy. Davis wanted the great transcontinental railroad to run along a southern route, tying the far west to the south, and a thriving northern crossing at Rock Island threatened that vision. The bridge sat on land next to a federal military reservation, the Rock Island Arsenal grounds, and Davis tried to use that to block it. In the spring of 1854, he moved against the bridge company's right to build across the government land. His effort was, in the end, brushed aside. The courts did not stop the project, and the building went on, but it tells you how high the stakes ran. The first bridge across the Mississippi was opposed by a sitting member of the president's cabinet, and the same sectional fault line that ran through the bridge fight, north against south, east and west against the river, would soon split the whole country into war. The crews worked for nearly 3 years. They started in the summer of 1853, and they finished in the spring of 1856. And on the 22nd of April, 1856, the people of Rock Island and Davenport gathered on both banks to watch the impossible happen. A locomotive named the Des Moines pulled the first train of passenger cars out onto the bridge, over the stone piers, across the wooden trusses, through the closed draw span, and onto the far shore. East had touched west. For the first time in the history of the continent, you could ride from the Atlantic side of the country across the Mississippi on a bridge. People cheered. It must have felt like the end of one age and the beginning of another, because it was. It lasted 2 weeks. On the morning of the 6th of May, 1856, a brand new steamboat called the Erie Afton came up the river. She was a fine boat, worth something like $50,000, and this was one of her first trips this high up the Mississippi. She came to the bridge, and she went to pass through the open draw, through the gate of hell. And something went wrong. The accounts disagree on exactly what. The current at the bridge was strong and tricky. The Afton cleared the draw, or nearly cleared it, and then her stern swung, and she struck a pier, or the span, and the impact knocked over the stoves in her cabin. With the boat full of wood and fresh paint, and the stoves spilled and burning, the fire took hold in minutes. The Erie Afton burned to the waterline, and the fire spread to the bridge. One whole wooden span caught and burned and dropped into the river. The boat was destroyed. The bridge was broken. And then something happened that tells you everything about how divided the country was over this. As the bridge burned, steamboats up and down the river blew their whistles in celebration. Bells rang. Rivermen toasted the fire. A great bridge, 3 years in the building, the first of its kind on earth, was burning into the Mississippi, and a large part of the country was glad, because to them it was not a bridge. It was an enemy, and the enemy was down. The owners of the Erie Afton did not stop at celebrating. They sued. The boat's owner, Captain John Hurd, backed by steamboat interests up and down the river and quietly cheered on by the merchants of St. Louis, brought suit against the Railroad Bridge Company. The case was called Hurd versus the Rock Island Bridge Company. The claim was simple, and it was deadly. They argued that the bridge was a material obstruction to the free navigation of the Mississippi, that it was a hazard placed in a public highway, and that therefore it was illegal, and the company should pay for the boat and her cargo damages they put in the tens of thousands of dollars. But everyone understood that the money was not really the point. If a court agreed that the bridge was an illegal obstruction, then no railroad could ever bridge the Mississippi anywhere, and the rivermen would keep their highway forever. The railroad knew what it was facing. So Henry Farnham and the bridge company went looking for the best trial lawyer they could get, and through Norman Judd, the railroad's general counsel, they hired a circuit attorney from Springfield, Illinois, who had spent years riding from county courthouse to county courthouse, and who had built a quiet reputation handling railroad cases. Abraham Lincoln. This was 1857. Lincoln was not yet famous. The great debates were a year away. The presidency was 3 years away. He was a working lawyer, and he took the case. But first, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories like this one unless enough people click. One click. Come back. Because what Lincoln did next is the kind of careful, patient work that decides history, and almost nobody remembers it. Lincoln did not just read the legal briefs. He went to the bridge. He went to Rock Island, and he studied the thing itself, the piers, the spans, the draw, and most of all the water. The whole case turned on the current. The steamboat side said the bridge piers had created dangerous, unnatural currents that grabbed boats and threw them into the structure. If that was true, the bridge really was a trap. So Lincoln went down to the water to find out for himself. The story that comes down to us is that he worked with a local young man named Benjamin Brayton, the son of the bridge's engineer, and that together they measured the river by timing how long it took objects to float between fixed points, learning the speed and the set of the current with their own eyes and a watch. He gathered the facts the way a builder gathers facts, with patience and with numbers, until he understood the river at that bridge better than the men suing him did. The trial opened in the United States Circuit Court in Chicago in September of 1857, before Justice John McLean, and it ran for the better part of 2 weeks. The courtroom was packed. The newspapers from New York to New Orleans followed it day by day, because everyone knew it was about far more than one burned steamboat. The plaintiff's lawyers brought pilot after pilot to testify that the bridge was a death trap, that the currents were impossible, that the draw was a gate to a graveyard. The defense brought its own witnesses, and Lincoln brought his reading of the current, and the careful argument that the pilot of the Erie Afton, not the bridge, had lost control of the boat. There were even witnesses for the bridge who suggested the fire had been less than honest, that the boat was insured, and that her loss was a touch too convenient, though that was never the heart of the case. The heart of the case was Lincoln's closing. He spoke to the jury for the better part of 2 days, and the argument he made was bigger than the bridge. He set the burned span of the Effingham against the whole future of the country. He pointed out, plainly, the river of traffic that was already crossing this single bridge. In the year the case covered, something on the order of 12,000 freight cars and 74,000 passengers had rolled across the Mississippi on this one structure. The country was moving west, he argued, and it had as much right to move west across the river as the steamboats had to move up and down it. The line that has come down through history is the simplest statement of the whole principle. That one man has as good a right to cross a river as another has to sail up and down it. The needs of the country that travels east and west, Lincoln argued, are just as real, just as worthy of the law's protection, as the needs of the country that travels north and south. Neither has the right to destroy the other. The river and the rail would both have to share the continent. When the jury went out, they could not agree. In the end, the count stood at 9 for the bridge and 3 against, and because they could not reach a verdict, the judge discharged them. A hung jury. In strict terms, nobody won. But everybody understood who had really won. The bridge had not been declared illegal. It had not been ordered destroyed. The steamboat men had thrown their best case at it, in front of a Chicago jury, with the most sympathetic possible plaintiff, and they had failed to bring it down. The bridge stood, and the trains kept crossing. One quick note. I turned the full story of the first bridge across the Mississippi into a book. Everything the records gave me, all the names and all the numbers. If you want it, the link is in the description. The rivermen were not finished. They had lost the Effingham case, but they went back to the courts again. In 1858, a St. Louis steamboat owner named James Ward filed a new suit, this time in federal court in Iowa, asking the court to declare the bridge a public nuisance and order it removed so the river could run free again. And at first, in Iowa, they got what they wanted. A federal judge ruled the bridge a nuisance and ordered part of it, the pier on the Iowa side, taken down. For a moment it looked as if the whole thing might be undone after all, that the steamboat men would win in the long run what they had lost in Chicago. But the case did not stop in Iowa. It climbed, the way these things do, all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And in the early 1860s, with the country torn apart by the very war that the bridge fight had foreshadowed, the High Court reversed the order. The justices understood the size of what they were deciding. If the Iowa ruling stood, the court reasoned, then no lawful bridge could ever be built across the Mississippi anywhere along its length. The court would not accept that. The river was a highway, yes, but the country had a right to cross it. A few years later, the Supreme Court went further still, ruling on the side of the bridges again and settling that fixed structures had a lawful, permanent place spanning the navigable rivers of the United States. The principle Lincoln had argued to a hung jury in Chicago became the law of the land. The age of bridging America had begun, and it began here. It is worth stopping on how strange that journey was. Think about it. The same Abraham Lincoln who stood at Rock Island timing the current and arguing to a jury that the country had a right to cross its rivers would, within 4 years, be President of the United States, holding that very country together through the war that the steamboat fight had been a rehearsal for. North against South. The old river economy of the slave-holding South against the new rail economy reaching out to the free West. The fault line ran right through the bridge. Jefferson Davis, who had tried to stop the crossing as Secretary of War, would lead the Confederacy. Lincoln, who had defended it, would lead the Union. And the bridge those two men had once stood on opposite sides of would help decide which way the West leaned, because the rails that crossed it carried the grain and the men and the iron of the North. The bridge was not just a feat of engineering, it was a piece of the machinery of the coming war, and almost nobody building it in 1855 could have known that. And the numbers behind it were not small. The first bridge was reported to have cost in the neighborhood of $250,000, a staggering sum for the time, raised and risked on the belief that crossing the river was worth more than fighting it. When the burned span dropped into the water in May, the railroad did not give up. They rebuilt. They had the span replaced and trains running again by the early autumn, in time for the trial itself to open, with the bridge whole and working. A quiet argument all its own that the thing could be maintained and would endure. There is a hard truth at the center of this story, and the channel has a rule about telling it plainly. We know the names of the men who fought over the bridge. Henry Farnham, who built it. Abraham Lincoln, who defended it. John Hurd, who sued it. Jefferson Davis, who opposed it. We know the captains and the lawyers and the judges, but the men who actually built the bridge, the men who stood in the cofferdams with the river pressing on the timber walls, the men who cut and hauled and set the stone, the men who raised the wooden trusses span by span and balanced the great swing draw on its turntable, those men are almost entirely unnamed. The records kept the boardroom and the courtroom. They did not keep the riverbed. We do not know who they were. We know only that they were there, in the cold water and on the high timber, and that the bridge they built carried the weight of a nation across a river that had never been crossed. Somebody should say their names. The trouble is, nobody wrote them down. And the work was dangerous in ways the records barely hint at. Driving timber into a riverbed, bailing out cofferdams below the waterline, hoisting stone and lifting heavy trusses with rope and animal power and human muscle, all of it over moving water. Bridge work and river work in that era hurt and killed men as a matter of routine. The cold of an upper Mississippi winter, the strength of the current, the simple weight of the materials, every one of those was a threat with no name. When we say the men who built it are unnamed, we should remember that some of them were almost certainly hurt building it, and we do not have their names either. They are part of the price of the bridge, and the price went unrecorded. What happened to the bridge itself is its own quiet drama. The first bridge, the wooden one, lived a hard life. In the spring of 1868, the river itself came for it. A great mass of ice came driving down the Mississippi and battered the piers and the timber spans, and within days, as if the river were not satisfied, a windstorm strong enough that people called it a tornado struck the bridge as well. The damage was severe, but crews came down from Chicago and repaired it and put the trains back across, because by now the country could not do without it. The wooden bridge had become a necessity. Then the railroad and the government built better. In that same year, 1868, Congress authorized a new and grander crossing at the same place, and in the early 1870s, the wooden bridge was replaced by an iron structure, a double-deck bridge carrying trains on one level and a roadway on the other, built in partnership between the railroad and the United States government, which by then ran the great arsenal on the island. That iron bridge in turn gave way, near the close of the century, to a stronger steel bridge built on the same line of piers, a double-track structure more than 1,800 feet long. That bridge, the one finished in the 1890s, is still there. It is called the Government Bridge, and it still swings open on its center pier to let the river traffic through, the same compromise the first engineers offered the river all those years ago. Cross the water, but leave a gate. Stand on the bank at Rock Island today and you can see it. A bridge across the Mississippi, trains on top, cars below. The long swing span turning slowly on its turntable when a barge needs to pass. It is not the original. The wood is long gone, burned and battered, and replaced generations ago. But it stands on the same ground, in the same gap in the river, doing the same impossible thing that a locomotive named the Des Moines did for the first time in the spring of 1856. And just nearby, near the water, you can still find the stub of an old pier, a piece of cut stone remembered as the footing of that very first crossing. A worn block of limestone, set by hand, by men whose names we do not have, in the middle of a river that everyone said could never be bridged. That is the thing I keep coming back to. They were told it could not be done. The most powerful river city in the country was against them. A cabinet secretary was against them. The whole steamboat economy was against them. The river burned their bridge 2 weeks after they finished it, and half the nation cheered. And still it stood. Because a handful of stubborn engineers, a careful lawyer who learned the current with his own hands, and a crowd of forgotten workmen in the cold water proved that the Great Wall of the Mississippi was not a wall after all. It was only a river. And a river can be crossed. The age of the steamboat passed. The rivermen were not wrong about what the bridge meant. Within a generation, the railroad did to the river what they had feared, and the great east-to-west traffic of the country moved onto the rails, and Chicago rose as the steamboat trade faded. An entire way of life faded out, slowly, the way the light goes at the end of a long day on the water. There is no villain in that, only the passing of an age. The boats grew fewer, the whistles grew quieter, and the bridges multiplied, until the Mississippi was crossed in 100 places, and nobody thought it remarkable at all. But it was remarkable. It started here, with a wooden bridge on stone piers and a burning steamboat, and a country deciding, in a Chicago courtroom that it had the right to cross its own great river. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss Tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.